Before history was written in books, it was written in symbols. Not symbols as decoration, but as a language, a precise system, a method of encoding ideas too large, too complex, or perhaps too dangerous to be spoken directly. Across ancient Egypt, Greece, India, and beyond, the same patterns begin to emerge. Temples aligned to the stars, numbers repeated in architecture, stories that mirror each other across continents that were never meant to touch. It gives the impression that something was being preserved, not invented, not imagined, preserved. And those who preserved it did not call themselves philosophers or priests in the way we understand today. They were initiates, individuals who had passed through systems of knowledge that were deliberately hidden from the general population, not because the knowledge was fragile, but because it required preparation to understand. This is where the idea of the mysteries begins, not mysteries as in unsolved questions, but mysteries as in structured teachings. The word itself has been diluted over time. Today a mystery is something unknown, something to be solved, something that exists temporarily in the absence of information. But in the ancient world, the mysteries were never meant to be solved. They were meant to be experienced. They were systems of initiation, carefully constructed environments where knowledge was not simply given, but revealed in stages, not through explanation, but through exposure, through symbol, ritual, and transformation. To enter these systems you did not apply. You were selected, observed, and tested, not for intelligence, but for readiness, because what was being taught was not information in the modern sense. It was a way of seeing, and once seen it could not be unseen. This is why the teachings were hidden, not out of elitism, but out of necessity, because without preparation the symbols would appear meaningless, the rituals would seem theatrical, the entire structure would collapse into superstition. But to the initiate, it was the opposite. Everything was precise. Every gesture, every image, every number carried weight. Nothing was accidental. And across different cultures separated by time and geography, these systems begin to resemble each other in ways that are difficult to ignore. Different names, different gods, different languages, but the same underlying structure, which raises a question that lingers beneath all of it. Were these systems developed independently or remembered? To understand what the mysteries were, you have to strip away the modern instinct to explain everything too quickly. These systems were not lectures. They were not texts to be studied in isolation. They were environments designed to change the individual moving through them. In places like ancient Egypt, Greece, and later Rome, the mystery schools operated as controlled spaces where perception itself was challenged. Initiates were led through sequences of symbolic events, often in darkness, often in silence, sometimes in states deliberately altered through fasting, isolation, or sensory manipulation. What they encountered inside these spaces was not presented as fact, but as experience. Images appeared before them, sounds echoed in chambers built with impossible acoustics. Rituals unfolded with precise choreography, each movement carrying meaning that could not be explained in words alone. The purpose was not to tell the initiate what reality was. The purpose was to destabilize their existing understanding of it. Because the assumption underlying all mystery traditions was simple but radical, that what most people call reality is only a surface layer, a constructed perception, a set of patterns accepted without question, because they are familiar. And beneath that surface there exists a deeper structure, one that can be recognized, but only after the individual has been prepared to see it. This is why symbols were used instead of direct statements, A symbol does not give you an answer. It forces you into a relationship with it. It lingers. It repeats. It begins to reveal different meanings depending on the state of the person observing it. And over time that relationship changes the observer. This is the foundation of the mysteries, not knowledge as something you collect, but knowledge as something that reshapes you. Within these systems, nothing was ever presented at face value. Every layer concealed another, and every answer led deeper into the structure rather than out of it. What appears at first glance to be mythology begins to shift under closer attention. The stories are not simply narratives about gods and heroes. They are frameworks, encoded sequences that mirror processes occurring within the individual. A descent into the underworld is not just a journey through a physical realm. It becomes a movement inward, a confrontation with what is hidden, suppressed, or unrecognized. A death within these stories is rarely final. It marks a transition, a dissolution of one state into another, and rebirth is not presented as a miracle, but as a consequence, something that follows naturally once a certain threshold has been crossed. These patterns repeat with such consistency across cultures that they begin to feel less like invention and more like observation, as though different civilizations were describing the same internal process, using the symbolic language available to them at the time. In the mystery traditions, these stories were not told for entertainment. They were enacted. Initiates did not simply hear about descent, death and rebirth. They moved through symbolic versions of these processes within the initiation itself. Darkened chambers became underworlds. Silence became isolation. The loss of orientation became a form of symbolic death. And then, at a precise moment, something would shift. Light would return. Sound would reappear. The initiate would be guided back not as the same person who entered, but as someone who had passed through a structured transformation. This is what separates the mysteries from philosophy or religion in the modern sense. They were not systems of belief, they were systems of experience. When viewed from the outside, these practices can seem theatrical, even excessive. Robes, symbols, hidden chambers, staged ordeals. It is easy to dismiss them as elaborate performances designed to impress or control, but that interpretation misses the function entirely. Every element within the mystery systems was designed to bypass the ordinary way the mind processes information, not by overwhelming it, but by redirecting it, by placing the individual into situations where familiar reference points no longer applied. In that state, something unusual happens. The mind, no longer anchored to its usual patterns, begins to reorganize. It becomes more receptive, more aware of subtle connections it would normally ignore. Patterns begin to emerge where none were seen before. This is why the environments were so controlled. Light was used deliberately. Darkness was not an absence, but a tool. Sound was shaped within spaces that amplified or distorted it in precise ways. Even movement was choreographed to guide attention without the initiate fully realizing it. Nothing was random, and more importantly, nothing was explained in the moment. Explanation would have reduced the experience to something conceptual, something that could be accepted or rejected too easily. Instead, the initiate was left to move through the sequence without certainty, without clear instruction, forced to engage directly with what was happening. This created a kind of internal tension, a gap between what was expected and what was experienced, and within that gap, new understanding could begin to form, not as something imposed from the outside, but as something discovered internally. This is why the mysteries relied so heavily on symbol and ritual, because both operate in a way that language cannot. They do not tell you what something means. They place you in a position where meaning begins to reveal itself. If you follow this pattern far enough, a larger structure begins to take shape. Different cultures, different eras, different names, yet the same underlying approach repeats. Knowledge is not handed over directly. It is concealed, layered, and revealed through experience. Symbols are used instead of statements. Transformation is prioritized over explanation. It suggests that these systems were not isolated inventions. They were expressions of a shared understanding about how human perception works. That to truly grasp something fundamental, it cannot be given in its final form. It has to be encountered, questioned, and gradually recognized. This is why the mysteries were always described as something to be entered, not something to be read. And it is also why they were often protected so carefully, not because they were fragile, but because they could be misunderstood. Stripped of their structure, the symbols lose their function, the rituals lose their meaning. What remains looks like fragments, pieces without context. But when the structure is intact, those same fragments begin to align, patterns repeat, ideas reinforce each other, and something more coherent starts to emerge beneath the surface. Not a single doctrine, not a fixed belief system, but a way of seeing. And once that way of seeing begins to take hold, it changes how everything else is interpreted. This is the foundation the rest of these teachings are built on. Not answers, but a framework. Not conclusions, but a system that reshapes how conclusions are reached. Before anything was taught, something had to be proven. Not proven in the sense of evidence, but proven through experience. Proven to the individual moving toward the threshold of the mysteries that they were capable of stepping beyond the ordinary way of seeing the world. This is where initiation begins, not as a ceremony, not as a title, but as a process of separation. Across the ancient mystery traditions described in the secret teachings of all ages, the first movement is always the same. The initiate is removed, either physically or symbolically, from their previous environment, from the familiar patterns that define their identity, their beliefs, and their sense of certainty. This removal is not gentle. It is deliberate, controlled, and often disorienting. Because what is being tested is not knowledge, but attachment. The attachment to what is known, to what feels stable, to what has never been questioned. In many of these systems, the initiate would undergo periods of isolation, time without external input, time where the usual structure of the world begins to soften, where the mind is left without constant reinforcement. At first, this creates discomfort. The absence of distraction reveals how dependent the mind is on repetition, on routine, on the continuous confirmation that what it believes is real remains unchanged. But as that repetition fades, something else begins to emerge, a heightened awareness, not dramatic, not immediate, but subtle, a sensitivity to internal movement, to thought patterns that would normally pass unnoticed, to emotional responses that reveal themselves without the usual noise to conceal them. This is the first threshold. Not knowledge, but awareness. Because without awareness, nothing that follows can take hold. This is why initiation was never open to everyone, not out of exclusion, but because the process itself required a willingness to endure instability, to step into a space where the familiar is no longer reliable, and where meaning is not immediately available. And this is where the distinction becomes clear. The mysteries were not designed to comfort, they were designed to transform. And transformation does not begin with understanding, it begins with disruption. If the mysteries began with separation, they continued with structure, because initiation was never random. It was not a spontaneous awakening, not a moment of sudden clarity that appeared without context. It was guided, deliberate, and built upon systems that had been refined over generations. These systems were designed with a specific purpose: to take an individual who sees the world in one way and gradually introduce them to another. But this transition could not happen all at once. If it did, it would collapse under its own weight. The mind resists sudden shifts. It rejects what it cannot integrate. And so the mysteries approached transformation differently. They broke it into stages. Each stage revealed only what the initiate was capable of recognizing at that moment. Nothing more. Nothing beyond their capacity to engage with it meaningfully. This is what made initiation feel controlled, even when it appeared chaotic. Because beneath the surface there was always an order, a sequence, a progression that guided the initiate from uncertainty toward recognition without ever fully explaining what was happening. And this is where modern interpretations often fall short. There is a tendency to reduce these systems to symbolism alone, to analyze the images, the rituals, the stories, as if they exist independently of the experience they were designed to create. But in doing so, something essential is lost. Because the mysteries were not symbolic systems in isolation. They were experiential systems that use symbols as tools. And without the experience, the symbols lose their function. They become decorative, abstract, something to interpret rather than something to move through. This is why initiation rites were always structured as processes rather than lessons. The initiate was not told what the symbol meant. They were placed within a sequence where the meaning would begin to emerge through interaction, through tension, through contrast, through the gradual breakdown of what they thought they understood. And as this process unfolds, something subtle begins to take shape, a shift in perception, not a replacement of one belief with another, but a loosening of the need to hold on to belief in the first place. Because the further one moves into the structure of the mysteries, the less it becomes about what is true, and the more it becomes about how truth is recognized. This is the difference, and it is a difference that cannot be explained directly, only approached. But before we go further into how these rites were constructed and what they were designed to do, take a moment to anchor yourself in this series. If this way of looking at the world is something you want to explore more deeply, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because each episode builds on the last, and the further you move into it, the more these patterns begin to connect. So the question becomes, if initiation is not about gaining knowledge, but about changing perception, what exactly is being changed? To understand initiation in its original form, it helps to look at how consistently it appears across different civilizations. In ancient Egypt, initiation was associated with temple complexes that functioned as more than places of worship. They were structured environments where the initiate was guided through a series of symbolic trials. These were not arbitrary challenges. They were designed to confront specific aspects of perception, forcing the individual to question what they relied on to make sense of the world. In Greece, the Eleusinian mysteries followed a similar pattern, though expressed through a different cultural language. Participants moved through stages that mirrored themes of loss, descent, and return. What mattered was not the story itself, but the experience of moving through it. And across other traditions, whether in the Near East, India, or later esoteric orders in Europe, the same underlying structure repeats. There is always a threshold, a point where the initiate leaves behind what is familiar and enters into a controlled environment where normal rules no longer apply. This threshold is essential, because initiation is not about adding something new to an existing framework. It is about destabilizing the framework itself. The initiate must reach a point where their usual way of interpreting reality is no longer sufficient, where the patterns they rely on begin to break down. Only then can something different begin to form. This is why many initiation rites involve forms of symbolic death, not literal death, but the removal of identity as it was previously understood. Names are taken away, status is stripped, the initiate is reduced to a state where the roles they have always identified with no longer hold. In that space there is uncertainty, and within that uncertainty there is potential, because without a fixed identity to maintain, the individual becomes more receptive to change, more open to new patterns of thought, more capable of recognizing structures that were previously invisible. This is not presented as a punishment, it is presented as a necessity, because the mysteries operate on a simple principle, that perception is conditioned, and anything that is conditioned can be altered, but alteration requires disruption, which is why the early stages of initiation often feel destabilizing rather than enlightening. The initiate is not being given answers. They are being placed in a position where their need for answers begins to dissolve, and as that need dissolves, something else takes its place, a different way of engaging with what is in front of them, not through immediate interpretation, but through observation. This is the beginning of a shift, a movement away from reacting to the world as it appears, and toward recognizing the structures that shape how it appears in the first place. And once that shift begins, it cannot be easily reversed, because the initiate has already crossed the first threshold. They have already experienced what it feels like for reality to loosen. And from that point on, the process of initiation continues, not as a single event but as a sequence, each stage building on the last, each movement taking the individual further away from certainty and deeper into awareness. If the first stage of initiation removes certainty, the next stage replaces it with structure. Not structure in the sense of rigid rules, but structure as a sequence of experiences that begin to guide perception in a new direction. Once the initiate has been separated from their previous framework, they are not left in chaos indefinitely. They are moved through a series of controlled environments, each one introducing a different aspect of the system they are entering. This is where symbolism becomes more precise. In many traditions, the initiate would encounter specific elements arranged in deliberate ways: light and darkness, sound and silence, movement and stillness. Each contrast was used to sharpen awareness, to draw attention to distinctions that are usually overlooked. A chamber filled with darkness is not simply an absence of light. It becomes a condition in which the mind begins to generate its own imagery, its own interpretations. Without external reference points, internal patterns become more visible. Similarly, the sudden introduction of light is not just illumination, it is a rupture, a reorientation, something that forces the initiate to adjust, to recognize how quickly perception can shift when conditions change. These experiences are not explained as they occur. The initiate is not told what the darkness represents, or why the light appears at a specific moment. Instead, they are left to move through the sequence without guidance, allowing the experience itself to imprint something deeper than explanation could achieve. This is where initiation differs from education in the modern sense. Modern education prioritizes clarity. It seeks to define, to label, to ensure that understanding can be measured and repeated. Initiation, by contrast, operates in ambiguity. It withholds definition so that the individual is forced to engage directly with what is happening. This engagement creates a different kind of understanding, one that is not based on memorization, but on recognition, and recognition does not arrive all at once. It builds. As the initiate moves through each stage, patterns begin to connect. Symbols encountered earlier start to take on new meaning when seen again in a different context. What once appeared isolated begins to form part of a larger system. This is intentional. Repetition is used, but not in the way it is commonly understood. It is not repetition for reinforcement, but repetition for deepening. Each return to a symbol or idea reveals another layer, another dimension that was not visible before. In this way, the initiate is gradually introduced to a form of perception that is more fluid, less dependent on fixed definitions, more responsive to context. And as this process continues, something begins to stabilize within the individual, not their previous sense of certainty, but a new kind of orientation, an ability to remain present within uncertainty without immediately trying to resolve it. This is a crucial shift, because the deeper stages of initiation rely on this capacity. Without it, the experiences that follow would feel overwhelming or meaningless. With it, they become coherent, even when they are not fully understood. This is how the system prepares the initiate for what comes next, not by giving them answers, but by reshaping how they relate to the absence of answers. And in doing so, it creates the conditions for a different kind of knowledge to emerge, not imposed from the outside, but recognized from within. When you step back from the specific rituals and environments described across the mystery traditions, a pattern begins to emerge that is less about culture and more about function. Different symbols, different languages, different settings, but the same mechanism. Initiation is not transferring knowledge from one person to another. It is reorganizing how the individual processes reality. And once you see it this way, the rituals stop looking like isolated traditions and start to look like tools. Tools designed to interact with the structure of perception itself. Because what these systems seem to recognize, long before modern psychology attempted to describe it, is that perception is not passive. It is constructed. The mind does not simply receive the world as it is. It filters it, shapes it, interprets it through patterns that are built over time. Patterns formed through repetition, reinforced through familiarity, and rarely questioned because they appear consistent. Initiation interrupts this, not by attacking those patterns directly, but by placing the individual in environments where those patterns no longer function properly. Darkness removes visual certainty. Silence removes auditory reference. Isolation removes social reinforcement. Each condition strips away a layer of what the mind relies on to stabilize its interpretation of reality. And in that stripped back state, something becomes visible that is usually hidden. The fact that perception itself is flexible, that what feels fixed is often just repeated, and what feels real is often just reinforced. This is not presented as a theory within the mysteries. It is presented as something the initiate experiences, and once experienced, it changes how everything else is understood. Because if perception can be altered, then meaning is not as stable as it appears. And if meaning is not stable, then the systems built on that meaning can also be questioned. This is where initiation moves beyond ritual and into something deeper. It becomes a method for examining the foundations of reality as it is personally experienced. Not in an abstract way, but in a direct embodied way. And this is why the process cannot be rushed, because the mind resists this kind of shift. It seeks to re-establish certainty as quickly as possible, to return to familiar interpretations, to rebuild the patterns that have just been disrupted. But the more the initiate moves through the process, the more difficult that becomes, because each stage reinforces the same underlying recognition. that what is perceived is not necessarily what is, and that the space between those two things is where understanding begins to form. This is the deeper function of initiation, not to provide answers, but to create a condition where the need for immediate answers begins to dissolve, and in that space a different relationship to knowledge starts to take shape, one that is not based on certainty, but on awareness. And once that shift occurs, it affects everything that follows. If initiation is a process that reshapes perception, then its effects do not end when the ritual is complete. They extend beyond the structure that created them, because once an individual has experienced the instability of their own perception, even briefly, something changes in how they relate to everything that follows. The world does not necessarily look different in an obvious way, but the certainty with which it is interpreted begins to soften. What once felt fixed now feels conditional. What once felt unquestionable now carries a degree of distance. And within that distance there is space. Space to observe without immediately concluding. Space to recognize patterns without needing to define them too quickly. Space to remain present within ambiguity without forcing resolution. This is the lasting effect of initiation. Not knowledge as something acquired, but awareness as something activated. And that awareness continues to operate even outside the controlled environments of the mystery traditions. It influences how symbols are perceived, how meaning is constructed, how experience is interpreted. Because once the individual has moved through a system that reveals the flexibility of perception, it becomes difficult to fully return to the assumption that reality is as stable as it once seemed. This does not create confusion, it creates sensitivity, a heightened attention to the subtle structures that shape experience, a recognition that what appears simple may contain layers that are not immediately visible. And this is where the process begins to extend beyond initiation itself, because the mysteries were never intended to end at the point of entry. They were designed to continue, to unfold gradually as the individual moves through life, encountering the same patterns in different forms, recognizing the same structures in different contexts. In this way, initiation is not a single event. It is the beginning of a way of seeing, and once that way of seeing takes hold, it begins to reveal something that was always present but rarely noticed, a coherence beneath the surface, a structure that connects ideas, symbols and experiences across time, not as a fixed system to be memorized, but as something that becomes more visible the more attention is given to it. This is what the initiation rites prepare the individual for. Not answers, but recognition. Not certainty, but awareness. And as this series continues, each layer will begin to build on that foundation, expanding the scope of what is being observed and deepening the way it is understood. Because initiation is only the beginning, and what follows moves far beyond the threshold. Knowledge in its most powerful form has rarely been public, not because it was impossible to share, but because it was never intended to exist without structure. What we now think of as learning, as something accessible, searchable and immediate, is a relatively recent development. For most of history, knowledge was not distributed freely. It was organized, protected, and revealed in stages. And this is where the idea of the secret schools begins to take shape. Not as hidden rooms filled with forbidden texts, but as systems. Systems designed to control how knowledge moves, how it is understood, and who is prepared to receive it. Across the ancient world, these schools existed in different forms. In Egypt, they were embedded within the temple complexes. In Greece, they appeared as philosophical orders and mystery traditions. In other cultures, they took on different names, different symbols, different structures. But the underlying principle remained consistent. Knowledge was not simply something to be collected, it was something to be approached. And approaching it required preparation, because what these schools recognized, long before modern systems of education, is that information without context can distort more than it reveals, that ideas, when taken out of sequence, can lose their meaning entirely. So instead of presenting knowledge as a complete system, they broke it apart, layer by layer, stage by stage, ensuring that each piece could only be understood in relation to what came before it. This created a very different relationship between the individual and what they were learning. It was no longer about accumulation, it was about alignment. The individual had to change in order to understand the material, not the other way around. And this is what made these schools appear secret, not because they were always hidden physically, but because the knowledge within them could not be accessed without moving through the structure that contained it. Which raises a question that sits at the center of all of this. If knowledge is structured in this way, then what happens when that structure is removed? If initiation prepares the individual, the secret schools provide the environment. Because once someone has crossed that first threshold, once their perception has begun to shift, they cannot simply return to the same way of learning. The systems that come next have to match that change. They have to be structured in a way that continues the process, not interrupts it. This is where the schools take over. Not as institutions in the modern sense, with open enrollment and standardized teaching, but as controlled systems of progression. Each level builds on the last. Each stage introduces a new layer of understanding, while quietly reinforcing everything that has already been experienced. And importantly, nothing is given too early. Because in these systems, timing matters just as much as content. An idea introduced before the individual is ready for it does not expand understanding. It distorts it. It creates false certainty. It encourages interpretation without foundation. So the schools avoid this entirely. They do not rush. They do not overwhelm. They move with precision. This is why knowledge within these traditions is often described as being veiled or hidden, not because it's deliberately obscured for the sake of secrecy, but because it exists behind layers that must be passed through in sequence. Each layer acts as both a barrier and a preparation. It prevents premature understanding, while also shaping the individual so that when the next layer is revealed, it can be recognized properly. And this is where the difference between modern education and these ancient systems becomes impossible to ignore. Modern education assumes that more information leads to greater understanding. That access is the solution. That if enough data is provided, clarity will follow. The secret schools operate on the opposite assumption. That too much information, given too quickly, creates confusion rather than clarity. That understanding is not a product of volume, but of structure, and that without the right sequence, even the most accurate knowledge can become meaningless. This is why the schools were selective, not in a superficial sense, but in a structural one. They required the individual to demonstrate that they could move through the system without distorting it, that they could hold uncertainty without rushing to conclusions, that they could recognize patterns without forcing them into something familiar. Only then would the next stage open. And this is what gives these systems their continuity. They do not depend on a single teacher, a single location, or a single tradition. They depend on structure, on the ability to pass the same framework from one generation to the next without losing its function, which means the real question is not where these schools were located. It is how they managed to preserve their structure over time. But before we go further into how that structure was maintained and how it was transmitted across cultures, take a moment to ground yourself in this series. If you're starting to see how these systems connect and how each episode builds on the last, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because this is not a series of isolated ideas, it is a progression. And the further you move into it, the more these patterns begin to align. So the question becomes, if knowledge requires structure to retain its meaning, what exactly is that structure designed to protect? To see how these schools functioned in practice, it helps to look at the way they organized knowledge itself. Across the traditions referenced in the secret teachings of all ages, knowledge was rarely presented as a single unified body of information. It was divided, categorized, structured into levels that corresponded not only to subject matter, but to the state of the individual engaging with it. This is why many of these systems speak in terms of outer teachings and inner teachings. The outer layer appears accessible. It deals with visible symbols, simplified explanations, narratives that can be understood without preparation. It provides a surface level of meaning that allows the system to exist publicly without revealing its deeper structure. But beneath that surface there is another layer, one that is not immediately visible and cannot be accessed simply by reading or observing. This inner layer contains the same symbols, the same ideas, but arranged in a way that reveals connections that are not apparent from the outside. The difference is not in the material itself, it is in how it is structured. For example, a symbol presented in the outer teaching might be understood in a literal or cultural sense. It might represent a deity, a natural force, or a philosophical concept. But within the inner teaching, that same symbol is repositioned. It becomes part of a system, a component within a larger pattern that relates to other symbols, other ideas, other structures. This is where meaning begins to shift, because the symbol is no longer isolated, it is contextual, and once something becomes contextual, it can no longer be understood in a fixed way. This is why the schools emphasize progression. The initiate was not simply exposed to more symbols, but to new relationships between them, connections that redefined what had already been seen, forcing a re-evaluation of previous understanding. In this way, knowledge within the secret schools was not linear, it was recursive. Each stage looped back to what came before, but from a different perspective. What once seemed simple became complex, what once seemed clear became layered, and what once seemed complete revealed itself to be only a fragment. This process required discipline, not in the sense of obedience, but in the ability to hold multiple interpretations without collapsing them into a single conclusion. The initiate had to resist the urge to finalize meaning too quickly, to allow the structure to unfold at its own pace, because within these systems, premature certainty was seen as a limitation, a sign that the individual had stopped engaging with the process. And this is where the real function of the schools becomes visible. They were not preserving information, they were preserving a method, a way of interacting with knowledge that prevented it from becoming static. Because once knowledge becomes static, it loses its ability to reveal anything new. The secret schools avoided this entirely by ensuring that every piece of information remained connected to something larger, something that could not be fully grasped at once, something that required continuous engagement. And in doing so, they created a system where understanding was never final. It was always in motion, always developing, always deepening. If knowledge within the secret schools was structured in layers, then access to those layers had to be controlled in a way that preserved their function. This is where the idea of degrees, ranks or levels begins to appear, not as a hierarchy of status, but as a mechanism of progression. Each level represents a shift in how the individual engages with the material. It is not simply a measure of how much has been learned, but of how that learning has changed the individual's perception. Because within these systems, advancement is not based on accumulation. It is based on transformation. The initiate does not move forward by knowing more. They move forward by seeing differently. This is why the transitions between levels are often marked by specific rites or thresholds. These moments are not symbolic in a superficial sense. They function as checkpoints within the structure, points where the individual demonstrates, not through explanation but through behavior and perception, that they have integrated what came before. Only then does the next layer become available. And this is where the schools differ fundamentally from open systems of learning. There is no skipping ahead, no accessing advanced material without moving through the earlier stages, because without the foundation, the higher levels would not make sense. They would appear abstract, disconnected, or even meaningless. This is not a limitation imposed by the system. It is a reflection of how the system is designed. Each level builds the conditions required to understand the next, and without those conditions, the material cannot be recognized for what it is. This is why secrecy plays such a central role, not as a means of exclusion, but as a form of protection of the structure. If the inner teachings were made fully visible without the necessary preparation, they would lose their coherence. The relationships between symbols would break down. The connections that give them meaning would disappear. What remains would look fragmented. And once fragmented, the system cannot function as intended. This is why the schools relied on controlled transmission. Knowledge was passed from one individual to another within a defined structure, ensuring that each stage was preserved as it was meant to be experienced. This transmission did not depend on written text alone. In many cases, the most important aspects were never written down. They were demonstrated, experienced, carried through direct interaction between those who had already moved through the system and those who were beginning it. This created continuity, not through fixed documents but through living practice, and because of this the schools were able to adapt, to shift across cultures, languages, and historical periods without losing their core function. The symbols could change, the stories could evolve, but the structure remained. And it is this structure that allowed the knowledge to survive, not in its original form, but in its original function, preserved not as information, but as a process that continues to unfold wherever the conditions for it are maintained. When you look at the structure of the secret schools as a whole, what begins to stand out is not the content they preserved, but the way they prevented that content from becoming distorted. Because distortion does not usually happen through deliberate corruption. It happens through fragmentation, through ideas being separated from the structure that gives them meaning, through symbols being interpreted without context, through knowledge being taken out of sequence and treated as complete. This is exactly what the schools were designed to avoid. By controlling progression, by limiting access, by structuring knowledge into layers that could only be entered in order, they created a system where meaning remained intact, not fixed but coherent. And once you see this, it becomes easier to recognize what happens when that structure is removed. The symbols remain, the stories remain, fragments of the teachings continue to circulate, but without the framework that connected them, they begin to shift. They become simplified, reinterpreted, sometimes even inverted. What was once part of a larger system becomes isolated, and in isolation it starts to take on meanings that were never originally intended. This is not necessarily a loss, it is a transformation, but it is a transformation that changes the function of the material. Instead of guiding perception, it becomes something to analyze. Instead of being experienced, it becomes something to debate. And in that shift, something essential is altered, because the original purpose of the system was not to create agreement, it was to create recognition. Recognition that emerges from direct engagement, not from explanation alone. This is why the secret schools place such emphasis on structure, because without structure, recognition becomes unlikely. The individual is left with fragments, attempting to assemble them into something meaningful without knowing how they were originally connected. And this often leads to one of two outcomes. Either the material is dismissed as incoherent, or it is overinterpreted in ways that impose meaning where there was none. Both outcomes move further away from the original function, which is why, even now, the idea of structured knowledge continues to appear in different forms. Not always in the same language, not always in the same symbols, but with the same underlying intention, to create a pathway, a sequence, a way of moving through information that preserves its ability to reveal something deeper over time. And once you recognize that, the idea of secrecy begins to shift. It is no longer about hiding information. It is about maintaining the conditions that allow that information to remain meaningful, which raises a different kind of question. If the structure is what preserves meaning, then what happens when that structure is deliberately reconstructed, not copied, but rebuilt, with the same principles, the same sequencing, the same attention to how perception changes over time? Because if the system can be broken down, it can also be rebuilt. If the secret schools were built to preserve structure, then their real legacy is not the symbols they used or the specific traditions they belong to. It is the method they established, a method that treats knowledge as something that must be approached in sequence, something that unfolds over time rather than something that can be understood all at once. And once that idea settles in, it begins to change how everything else is seen, because it suggests that meaning is not contained within individual pieces of information. It emerges from the relationships between them, from the order in which they are encountered, from the state of the individual encountering them. This is a very different way of thinking about knowledge. It shifts the focus away from accumulation and toward integration, away from having answers and toward recognizing patterns, and in doing so it redefines what it means to understand something. Understanding is no longer a final point, it becomes a process, something that continues to develop as new connections are made, as previous ideas are revisited, as perception itself continues to shift. This is why the structure of the secret schools matters, even now. Not because those exact systems still exist in their original form, but because the principle behind them continues to apply. Whenever knowledge is approached without structure, it tends to fragment. It becomes overwhelming, disconnected, difficult to integrate in a meaningful way. But when it is approached through sequence, through progression, through deliberate exposure over time, something different happens. It begins to stabilize, patterns become clearer, connections become easier to recognize. And what once felt complex starts to reveal an underlying simplicity, not because it has been reduced, but because it has been properly organized. This is what the schools were designed to do, not to limit access, but to preserve coherence, not to control knowledge, but to maintain its function. And once you see that, the idea of secrecy begins to lose its surface meaning entirely. It is no longer about what is hidden, it is about what is structured, because structure is what allows something to be understood, not just observed. And as this series continues, that structure will begin to appear more clearly, not as a rigid system, but as a pattern that repeats across different teachings, different symbols, different traditions, a pattern that becomes more visible the more attention is given to it, because the schools themselves may no longer exist in the same form, but the method they use still does, and once recognized it can be followed, not by entering a hidden institution, but by moving through knowledge in the way it was always intended to be experienced, step by step, layer by layer, until what once seemed separate begins to align. Knowledge does not preserve itself, it requires carriers, not just people who repeat it or record it, but individuals who can hold it without distorting it, individuals who can move through it without reducing it to something simpler than it is, individuals who understand that what they are carrying is not just information, but structure. This is where the figure of the initiate begins to take shape, not as a title, not as a role defined by status, but as a function within the system. Because once knowledge is organized into layers, once it is structured in a way that depends on sequence and progression, it cannot be left unattended. It cannot be placed into the open and expected to remain intact. It has to be maintained. And that maintenance requires a specific kind of individual, someone who has already moved through the structure, someone who has experienced the transformation it creates, someone who can recognize when that structure is being followed correctly and when it is beginning to break down. Across the traditions outlined in the secret teachings of all ages, these individuals appear under different names: priests, philosophers, adepts, keepers. But the title is less important than the role, because the role remains consistent. They act as intermediaries, not between people and truth, but between the individual and the structure that reveals it. And this is where a common misunderstanding begins to fall apart. The initiate is often imagined as someone who possesses hidden knowledge, someone who has access to secrets that others do not. But within the mystery traditions, this is not the defining feature. What defines the initiate is not what they know, it is how they engage with what they know, because knowledge without the ability to hold it correctly becomes unstable, it becomes simplified, it becomes distorted, and once distorted it loses the very quality that made it valuable in the first place. So the initiate does not simply receive knowledge, they become responsible for it. Responsible for maintaining its structure, responsible for ensuring that it is transmitted in a way that preserves its function. And this responsibility changes how they move through the world, because they are no longer interacting with knowledge as something external. They are interacting with it as something that must be carried, which raises a different kind of question. If knowledge depends on individuals to preserve it, then what kind of person does that require? If the secret schools provide structure and initiation reshapes perception, then the initiate becomes the point where those two things meet. Because structure on its own is not enough. It can exist in theory, it can be written, symbolized, even preserved in fragments, but without someone who has moved through it, who understands how it functions from within, it remains incomplete. This is where the role of the initiate becomes essential, not as a passive recipient, but as an active participant in the continuation of the system. Across the traditions explored in the secret teachings of all ages, the initiate is never described as someone who has reached an endpoint. There is no final position where knowledge is complete, where understanding is fixed, where nothing further can be revealed. Instead, the initiate exists in a state of continuation, always moving, always refining, always returning to what has already been encountered, but from a different perspective. This is what allows the system to remain alive, because once knowledge is treated as complete, it begins to stagnate. It becomes rigid. It loses the ability to adapt, to reveal new layers, to respond to different contexts. The initiate prevents this, not by changing the structure, but by maintaining their relationship to it, by remaining engaged, by resisting the urge to reduce it to something static or final. And this is where the distinction between knowing and understanding becomes important. Knowing can be accumulated. It can be stored, repeated, shared. Understanding is different. It is dynamic. It shifts as perception shifts. It deepens as new connections are made, and it cannot be separated from the individual experiencing it. This is why the initiate is not defined by what they can explain. They are defined by how they engage, how they hold ambiguity, how they move through uncertainty, how they recognize patterns without forcing them into premature conclusions, because these qualities determine whether the structure can continue to function through them. And this is where responsibility begins to emerge, not as an external obligation, but as a natural consequence of moving through the system. The more the initiate sees, the more they recognize how easily that structure can be misinterpreted, how quickly symbols can lose their context, how easily knowledge can become fragmented when it is removed from the sequence that gives it meaning. And in recognizing this, their role begins to shift from participant to carrier. But before we move deeper into what that responsibility actually looks like and how it shapes the behavior of the initiate, take a moment to ground yourself in the progression of this series. If you're starting to see how these elements connect, how initiation leads into structure, and how structure requires individuals to maintain it, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because this is not a collection of isolated ideas. It is a system unfolding, and the further you move into it, the more that system begins to reveal itself. So the question becomes, if the initiate is responsible for carrying the structure, what ensures that they do not distort it? To understand how initiates preserve knowledge without distorting it, you have to look at the way they are trained to relate to what they learn. Because within the systems described in The Secret Teachings of All Ages, the initiate is not encouraged to treat knowledge as something they own. Ownership creates attachment, and attachment leads to distortion. If an idea becomes something the individual identifies with, something they feel responsible for defending or maintaining in a fixed form, it begins to lose its flexibility. It becomes rigid. It stops evolving. And in that rigidity, it can no longer reflect the deeper structure it originally pointed toward. So instead, the initiate is trained to hold knowledge differently, not as something to possess, but as something to move through. This requires a specific kind of discipline, the ability to engage with an idea fully, to explore its depth, to recognize its patterns, while at the same time remaining aware that any single interpretation is incomplete. This does not create indecision. It creates openness, an awareness that meaning is not fixed, but relational, that it shifts depending on context, perspective, and the state of the individual engaging with it. This is why the initiate is repeatedly exposed to the same symbols and teachings at different stages of their progression, not to reinforce a single meaning, but to reveal multiple layers. A symbol encountered early in the process might appear simple, almost obvious. It may be understood in a literal or cultural sense, but as the initiate moves through the system, that same symbol begins to change. Not because the symbol itself has altered, but because the relationship to it has. New connections become visible. Patterns that were previously hidden begin to emerge, and what once seemed complete reveals itself to be only one aspect of something larger. This process prevents fixation. It ensures that knowledge remains fluid, capable of expanding rather than collapsing into a single interpretation. And this fluidity is essential, because the structures the mysteries are attempting to reveal are not static. They are dynamic. They operate across different levels, connecting ideas that cannot be reduced to a single explanation without losing their complexity. So the initiate must learn to reflect that dynamic quality, to hold knowledge in a way that allows it to remain active, responsive, capable of revealing new relationships over time. This is what protects the structure from distortion. Not secrecy alone, not restriction alone, but the way the initiate is trained to engage with what they are given. And once this way of engaging becomes established, it begins to influence everything else. Not just how knowledge is understood, but how it is communicated. Because the initiate cannot simply pass information forward in a fixed form. They must present it in a way that allows the next individual to move through it, to experience it, to recognize it for themselves. Which means the initiate is not just preserving knowledge, they are preserving the conditions that allow that knowledge to function. If the initiate is trained to hold knowledge without fixing it into a single meaning, then the next question becomes how that knowledge is passed on without losing its structure. Because transmission is where distortion most often occurs. Not through intention, but through simplification. When something complex is reduced too quickly, it becomes easier to communicate, but harder to recognize in its original form. The relationships between ideas begin to disappear. The depth collapses into surface-level explanation, and what remains, while still accurate, in fragments, no longer functions as part of a larger system. This is what the initiates are trained to avoid. They do not transmit knowledge by explaining it directly in its most complete form. Instead, they mirror the structure through which they received it. They introduce it in stages. They allow it to unfold. They present symbols, ideas, and experiences in a sequence that encourages recognition rather than immediate conclusion. This is why much of what is preserved within these traditions appears indirect. Stories are used instead of definitions. Symbols are used instead of statements. Questions are used instead of answers. At first, this can seem inefficient. It can appear as though clarity is being withheld, but in reality it is being protected. Because clarity that arrives too quickly is often mistaken for understanding, and understanding that has not been built through progression tends to remain shallow. The initiate recognizes this. They understand that meaning must develop within the individual, not be imposed from the outside, so they guide rather than instruct. They create conditions rather than provide conclusions, and in doing so they maintain the integrity of the structure. This approach also requires restraint. The initiate must resist the impulse to reveal everything at once, even when they are capable of doing so. They must allow the process to take its course, trusting that the sequence itself will produce the necessary recognition over time. This is not always easy, because it means accepting that not everyone will move through the structure at the same pace, that some will misinterpret what is presented, that others will stop at a certain level, believing they have reached a conclusion when in reality they have only encountered an early stage. But this variability is part of the system. It reflects the fact that perception develops differently in each individual, and the initiate cannot control that development. They can only maintain the structure that supports it. This is why the role is less about authority and more about alignment. The initiate is not positioned above others in a hierarchical sense. They are positioned within the system in a way that allows them to maintain its function, and that function depends on continuity, on the ability to pass the structure forward without breaking it, without reducing it, without fixing it into something it was never meant to be. Because once that happens, the system begins to lose its depth. It becomes easier to access, but harder to truly engage with, and over time it can collapse into something entirely different, which is why the initiate must remain aware of the balance between clarity and complexity, between revealing and withholding, between guiding and allowing, because it is within that balance that the structure remains intact, and it is that structure that ensures the knowledge continues to function as it was intended. When you step back from the roles, the rituals, and the language used to describe initiates, a clearer pattern begins to emerge. The initiate is not defined by what they know. They are defined by what they do not rush to conclude. This is what separates them from a passive observer of knowledge, because the instinct to conclude quickly, to settle on a fixed interpretation, is one of the primary ways meaning becomes limited. It creates closure where there should be openness. It replaces exploration with certainty, and within the systems outlined in the secret teachings of all ages, this instinct is deliberately challenged. Not removed entirely, but slowed down. The initiate is trained to recognize the moment where interpretation begins to solidify, and to remain within that moment without immediately resolving it, to observe how meaning forms, rather than simply accepting the first version of it that appears. This creates a different relationship to knowledge, one that is less about finding the right answer and more about understanding how answers take shape in the first place. And once this shift occurs, it changes how everything else is approached. Symbols are no longer seen as puzzles to be solved, but as systems to be engaged with. Ideas are no longer treated as isolated truths, but as parts of a larger structure that can only be understood in relation to each other. Experience itself begins to take on a different quality, not because it changes externally, but because the way it is processed internally becomes more flexible, less reactive, more observant. And this is where the role of the initiate begins to extend beyond the formal structure of the schools. Because once this way of engaging is established, it cannot be confined to a specific environment. It carries into everything, into how conversations are interpreted, into how information is received, into how patterns are recognized in everyday situations. The initiate does not switch this off. It becomes their default state, and in that state something interesting begins to happen. The distinction between structured knowledge and ordinary experience starts to blur, because the same patterns that were encountered within the system begin to appear outside of it, not in the same form, not with the same clarity, but in ways that can be recognized by someone who has been trained to see them. This is what allows the system to continue without needing to be physically present, because the initiate becomes part of its continuation, not by recreating the exact conditions, but by maintaining the way of seeing that those conditions produced. And this is where the idea of the guardian begins to make sense, not as someone protecting secrets from others, but as someone maintaining the integrity of a process that can easily be misunderstood, simplified or reduced if approached without the necessary awareness. And that awareness is what the initiate carries, not as something separate from themselves, but as something that shapes how they engage with everything that follows. If the initiate is the one who carries the structure forward, then the most important question is not what they know, but how that knowledge continues to function through them. Because nothing within these systems was designed to remain static. The symbols evolve, the language changes, the cultural context shifts, but the process remains, and it is the initiate who ensures that this process does not collapse into something fixed or simplified as it moves through time. This is why their role cannot be reduced to teaching in the conventional sense. They are not there to provide answers. They are there to maintain conditions that allow others to move through the same sequence, to encounter the same patterns, to arrive at recognition through their own experience rather than through direct instruction. And this is what gives the system its continuity, not the preservation of exact forms, but the preservation of function. Because once the function is maintained, the form can adapt. It can take on new expressions, new symbols, new frameworks, without losing its ability to reveal the same underlying structure. This is what allows these ideas to appear across different cultures, different eras, different traditions, while still carrying a sense of familiarity, not because they are identical, but because they operate in the same way. And once that becomes clear, the role of the initiate begins to feel less distant, less confined to ancient systems or hidden orders, because the qualities that define that role are not dependent on a specific time or place. They are dependent on how an individual engages with knowledge, how they hold it, how they allow it to develop, how they resist the urge to reduce it too quickly into something final. This is where the idea of guardianship becomes relevant in a broader sense, not as a position to be claimed, but as a responsibility that emerges naturally when someone begins to recognize the importance of structure. Because once you see how easily meaning can fragment when structure is lost, it becomes difficult to ignore. And once you recognize that, your relationship to knowledge begins to change. It becomes less about collecting ideas and more about maintaining coherence, less about reaching conclusions and more about understanding how those conclusions are formed. And in that shift, something subtle but significant takes place. The individual moves from being a consumer of knowledge to a participant in its continuation. This is the role the initiate embodies, not as a final identity, but as an ongoing process, one that continues to unfold wherever the conditions for it are maintained. And as this series moves forward, those conditions will begin to appear in different forms, through symbols, through systems, through patterns that repeat across traditions in ways that begin to feel less coincidental and more intentional, because the initiate is not the end of the system. They are the point through which it continues. There are places that are built to be used, and there are places that are built to change you. At a distance, they can look the same. Stone structures, pillars, chambers, carefully arranged spaces designed with intention. But the difference is not in how they appear, it is in what they do. Across the traditions explored in the secret teachings of all ages, the temple is never just a building. It is not simply a location where rituals take place, or where teachings are delivered. It is part of the system itself. A constructed environment designed to influence perception, to guide movement, to shape experience in ways that are not immediately obvious. This is why temples across different cultures share certain characteristics, even when separated by time and geography. They are aligned with celestial patterns. They are structured with precise geometry. They are built with an attention to proportion that feels deliberate, even when the purpose is not explained, because the temple is not passive, it is active. Every dimension, every angle, every space within it contributes to how it is experienced, and that experience is not random, it is controlled, not in an obvious way, not through force, but through design. the way light enters a chamber, the way sound travels through a corridor, the way movement is directed through a sequence of spaces. Each element plays a role, and when combined they create something more than architecture. They create a condition where the individual entering the space begins to experience a shift, subtle at first, almost unnoticeable but present, because the temple is not designed to present information, it is designed to alter how information is received. And once that shift begins, the space itself becomes part of the teaching, not through explanation but through interaction, which raises a question that changes how these structures are seen entirely. If the temple is not just a place, then what exactly is it? If the initiate carries the structure, the temple becomes the place where that structure is made visible. Not explained, not written, but built. Because within the traditions described in the secret teachings of all ages, the temple is not separate from the teaching. It is the teaching, expressed through space. Every movement within it is intentional. Every transition from one area to another marks a shift, not just physically, but perceptually. The individual does not simply walk through a temple, they move through a sequence. And that sequence is designed to mirror the same progression found within the initiation process itself, from outer to inner, from light to darkness, from noise to silence, from certainty to uncertainty. Each step brings the individual further away from the ordinary structure of the world and deeper into a controlled environment where perception can begin to change. This is why the temple is often described as a representation of something larger, not as a metaphor, but as a functional model, a scaled expression of a broader system, arranged in a way that allows it to be experienced directly. Because just as knowledge is structured in layers, the temple is structured in spaces. Outer chambers that are accessible, inner chambers that are restricted, and at the center, a point that represents something beyond both. But this structure is not simply architectural, it is psychological. Each movement inward requires a shift in how the individual engages with what is around them. The external begins to lose its dominance. Attention turns inward. Awareness becomes more focused, more precise. And as this happens, the environment itself begins to feel different. Not because it has changed, but because the way it is being perceived has. This is the purpose of the temple, not to impress, not to display, but to create conditions. Conditions where the individual can move through a structured experience that gradually reshapes how they interpret reality. And this is why the temple cannot be separated from the initiate. One provides the environment, the other provides the awareness. Without both, the process cannot function, because the space alone does nothing, and the individual alone remains within their existing patterns. It is the interaction between the two that creates the shift. But before we move deeper into how these spaces are designed and what specific elements within them are intended to do, take a moment to ground yourself in this progression. If you're starting to see how the initiate, the structure and the environment all connect, make sure to like, share and subscribe, because each episode is building a system, and the further you move into it, the more those connections begin to align. So the question becomes, if the temple is a constructed environment designed to shape perception, what elements within it are actually doing the work? To understand how the temple functions as part of the teaching, you have to look at how its elements are arranged, because nothing within these spaces is accidental. Across the traditions described in the secret teachings of all ages, the layout of the temple follows a consistent principle. Movement from the outer to the inner. This is not simply a physical direction, it is a progression. The outer areas of the temple are accessible. They are often open, visible and designed to accommodate those who have not yet entered the deeper stages of the system. These spaces may contain symbols, images, or structures that introduce the language of the tradition, but do not reveal its full meaning. They are preparatory. They allow the individual to become familiar with the environment, to begin engaging with its patterns without being overwhelmed by them. As the individual moves further inward, the structure begins to change. Spaces become more enclosed. Light becomes more controlled, sound becomes more focused. Each shift reduces external distraction and increases internal attention. This is not done abruptly, it is gradual, because the transition itself is part of the process. The individual is not forced into a different state, they are guided toward it. And as this guidance continues, the environment begins to demand a different kind of engagement. Casual observation becomes less effective. The initiate must become more attentive, more aware of subtle changes, more responsive to the way the space itself is influencing their perception. This is where the temple begins to function as more than architecture. It becomes a mechanism, a system that interacts with the senses in a controlled way. Light is used to direct focus, darkness is used to remove distraction, sound is shaped to alter awareness, movement is structured to guide attention from one point to another. Each element contributes to a sequence that mirrors the internal progression of the initiate, from external awareness to internal recognition. And at the center of this structure, there is often a space that represents a culmination, not an endpoint, but a point of convergence, a place where the outer and inner aspects of the system meet. This central space is rarely explained directly. It is experienced, and what is experienced there depends on the state of the individual entering it, because by the time the initiate reaches this point, their perception has already begun to change. They are no longer engaging with the space in the same way they did at the entrance. They are more sensitive, more aware, more capable of recognizing patterns that would have gone unnoticed before. And this is what allows the temple to function as part of the teaching. It does not present meaning in a fixed form. It creates conditions where meaning can emerge through interaction, which means the temple is not simply a container for knowledge. It is an active participant in how that knowledge is revealed. If the temple guides movement from the outer to the inner, then the next layer of its function lies in how it encodes meaning within its structure. Because beyond layout and progression, the temple operates through proportion. Not arbitrary proportion, but relationships. Ratios that repeat, angles that align, dimensions that correspond to patterns found beyond the building itself. Across the systems outlined in the secret teachings of all ages, these proportions are not treated as decorative choices. They are treated as reflections. The idea is simple but precise, that the structure of the temple mirrors the structure of something larger. Whether that is understood as the cosmos, the human body, or a deeper underlying order, the principle remains the same. The temple is built as a model, a way of bringing abstract relationships into a physical form that can be experienced directly. This is why geometry becomes so important, not as mathematics for its own sake, but as a language, a way of expressing relationships that remain consistent regardless of culture or interpretation. A square does not change depending on who observes it. A circle does not shift based on belief. These forms carry a stability that allows them to act as anchors within the system, and when arranged in specific ways, they begin to reveal patterns that extend beyond the immediate structure. The initiate may not be told what these patterns represent, but through repeated exposure, through movement within the space, through the interaction of light, shadow, and proportion, something begins to register. a sense of coherence, a recognition that the space is not random, that its elements relate to each other in a way that feels ordered, even if that order is not fully understood. This recognition is important because it shifts the focus away from isolated details and toward relationships. The initiate begins to see not just what is present, but how it connects, how one element reflects another, how changes in position alter perception, how movement through the space reveals different aspects of the same underlying structure. And this is where the temple extends beyond its physical form. Because once this way of seeing is activated, it does not remain confined to the building. The initiate begins to recognize similar patterns elsewhere, in natural forms, in constructed environments, in systems that were not initially associated with the temple itself. This is the purpose of encoding, not to hide meaning in a way that prevents access, but to embed it in a way that requires interaction. The meaning is not extracted, it is encountered. And because it is encountered through experience rather than explanation, it carries a different kind of weight. It is not something that can be easily dismissed or replaced. It becomes part of how perception operates. This is why the temple is described as sacred, not because of what it contains, but because of how it functions. It creates a space where relationships become visible, where structure can be experienced directly, where the individual is not just observing a system, but moving through it, and in doing so beginning to recognize that the same structure may exist beyond the walls that first revealed it. When you step back from the physical structure of the temple, what becomes clear is that its function is not limited to architecture. It is a method, a way of organizing experience so that perception can be guided without direct instruction. Because what the temple demonstrates, more clearly than any written teaching, is that environment shapes awareness, not in an abstract sense, but in a precise and measurable way. Change the light, and attention shifts. Change the scale, and the body responds differently. Change the sequence of movement, and perception begins to follow that sequence. This is not theoretical, it is immediate, and once it is experienced it becomes difficult to ignore, which is why the temple does not rely on explanation. It does not need to. The individual moving through it begins to recognize the effect directly, and this recognition begins to extend beyond the space itself. Because if a constructed environment can shape perception so effectively, then it raises a larger question. What other environments are doing the same thing, without being recognized? This is where the function of the temple becomes more subtle. It is not only shaping perception within its walls, it is training the individual to recognize how perception is shaped elsewhere, in spaces that are not designed with the same intention, in systems that operate without awareness of their own structure, in everyday environments that influence behavior without appearing to do so. The initiate begins to notice these patterns, not in the same clarity as within the temple, but in fragments, in moments where something feels directed, where attention is pulled in a certain way, where movement follows a path that seems natural, but is actually constructed. And this recognition creates distance, not detachment but awareness, an ability to see that experience is not neutral, that it is shaped, guided, influenced by structures that are often invisible to those moving through them. This is where the temple shifts from being a place to being a reference, a model that reveals how structure operates, and once that model is understood, it can be applied, not in a literal sense but as a way of interpreting the world, because the same principles begin to appear in different forms, in how information is presented, in how spaces are arranged, in how attention is directed across different contexts. And this is where the initiate's role begins to expand again, because they are no longer only moving through structured environments, they are recognizing structure everywhere, seeing how perception is shaped, even in systems that were not designed with the same level of awareness, and this changes how those systems are engaged with. Because once the structure becomes visible, it can no longer operate in the same way. It loses its invisibility, and in losing that invisibility, it loses part of its influence. This is the deeper function of the temple, not just to shape perception, but to reveal that perception is always being shaped. And once that is recognized, the way the world is experienced begins to shift, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, as more patterns become visible, as more structures begin to reveal themselves, as the individual moves from simply existing within environments to understanding how those environments operate. If the temple reveals that space can shape perception, then its influence does not end at its walls. It continues wherever structure exists, because once the individual has moved through an environment that is deliberately designed to guide awareness, something shifts in how all environments are experienced. They are no longer neutral. They are no longer simply places to move through without question. They become systems. Arrangements of form, light, movement and sequence that influence how attention is directed and how meaning begins to take shape. And this recognition is not theoretical. It becomes immediate, subtle but persistent. The individual begins to notice how certain spaces create focus while others create distraction, how movement is encouraged in one direction rather than another, how the arrangement of elements changes the way something is perceived, even when the elements themselves remain the same. This is the continuation of what the temple begins, not a lesson that ends, but a shift that carries forward. Because once the relationship between structure and perception is recognized, it cannot be easily ignored. It becomes part of how the world is interpreted, and this is where the idea of sacred space begins to evolve. It is no longer confined to specific locations or traditions. It becomes a principle, a way of understanding that certain conditions create certain responses, that the environment is not separate from experience, but actively involved in shaping it. And with that understanding comes a different kind of awareness, not just of the spaces that are intentionally designed, but of those that are not, spaces that influence without intention, systems that shape behavior without recognizing that they are doing so. And this awareness creates a form of choice, not the ability to control every environment, but the ability to recognize how those environments are operating, to move through them with attention rather than assumption, to see where perception is being guided and where it can be redirected. This is what the temple prepares the individual for, not to remain within its structure, but to carry its principles beyond it, to recognize that the same patterns can appear anywhere, in architecture, in systems, in the arrangement of information, in the ways attention is directed across different aspects of life. And as this series continues, those patterns will begin to expand, moving from physical space into systems of thought, into symbolic frameworks, into structures that operate beyond what can be directly seen, because the temple is only one expression of a larger idea, an idea that continues to appear in different forms, each one revealing another aspect of how perception is shaped and how it can be understood. And once that idea begins to take hold, the world itself starts to feel less like a collection of separate experiences and more like a series of interconnected structures, each one influencing the next, each one revealing something about the system as a whole, which is where the next stage begins, because if space can be structured, then so can language. And what happens when the structure of language itself begins to shape how reality is understood? Before language was spoken, it was seen, not as words arranged in sentences, but as symbols arranged in space, forms that carried meaning without needing to be translated, patterns that could be recognized without being explained. Across the traditions referenced in the secret teachings of all ages, there is a recurring idea that language, as it exists today, is not the original form of communication. It is a development, a system that emerged to simplify, to organize, to make meaning more accessible. But in doing so, something was lost. Because spoken and written language depends on agreement, words only function if their meaning is shared, if definitions remain stable, if the structure of the system is maintained. And while this creates clarity, it also creates limitation. A word points to something, but it cannot contain it fully. It reduces complexity into a form that can be communicated, but in that reduction, certain aspects are inevitably left behind. Symbols operate differently. They do not rely on fixed definitions. They do not require a single interpretation. Instead, they create a field of meaning, a space where multiple layers can exist at once, where relationships between ideas can be expressed without needing to be broken down into separate parts. This is why symbols appear so frequently within the mystery traditions, not as decoration, not as coded messages to be deciphered once and understood completely, but as tools, ways of engaging with meaning that extend beyond what language alone can provide. Because a symbol does not tell you what something is, it shows you how it relates, and in showing that relationship it allows meaning to emerge gradually, rather than being imposed immediately. This is a very different way of communicating, one that requires attention rather than interpretation, recognition rather than definition. And once you begin to engage with symbols in this way, something becomes clear. That language, as it is commonly used, may not be the most complete way of expressing reality, which raises a question that sits at the edge of all of this. If symbols came before words, then what kind of language did they form? If the temple showed that space can guide perception, then symbols show that meaning can exist before language ever attempts to define it. Because within the traditions outlined in the secret teachings of all ages, symbols are not treated as secondary to words. They are treated as primary, not something that represents meaning after it has been formed, but something that participates in the formation of meaning itself. This is a crucial distinction. In modern systems, language is often considered the main tool for understanding. Words are used to describe, to explain, to categorize experience into forms that can be communicated clearly. But symbols operate differently. They do not categorize, they connect. They allow multiple ideas to exist in relation to each other without needing to be separated into individual definitions. And because of this, they are capable of expressing complexity in a way that language struggles to maintain. This is why symbols appear across cultures, even when the languages themselves are entirely different. A circle can represent completeness, unity, or continuity without needing translation. A triangle can suggest structure, balance, or direction, depending on how it is positioned and what it is placed alongside. These meanings are not fixed. They emerge through interaction, through context, through the relationship between one symbol and another. And this is where the idea of a lost language begins to take form. Not as a language that has disappeared completely, but as a way of communicating that has been overshadowed by more linear systems. Systems that prioritize clarity, precision, and agreement over openness, relationship, and layered meaning. But within the mystery traditions, this symbolic language was never abandoned. It was preserved, not as a replacement for spoken language, but as a parallel system, one that could operate where words became insufficient, one that could carry meaning across different levels at once. And this is why the initiate is trained to engage with symbols directly, not to translate them immediately into words, but to observe them, to notice how they interact, to recognize patterns that emerge over time, because the meaning is not contained in the symbol alone. It exists in the relationship between symbols, in the structure they form when placed together. This is what gives symbolic language its depth. It is not linear. It does not move from one point to another in a fixed sequence. It expands. It layers. It reveals different aspects depending on how it is engaged with. And this is why it requires a different kind of attention, not the kind that seeks immediate answers, but the kind that allows meaning to develop gradually. But before we move further into how this symbolic language operates, and how it was used within the mystery traditions, take a moment to ground yourself in the progression of this series. If you're starting to see how structure, space, and now symbol all connect, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because each episode is building a system, and the further you move into it, the more that system begins to reveal itself. So the question becomes, if symbols create meaning through relationship rather than definition, how are those relationships structured? To understand how symbolic language functions, you have to step away from the assumption that meaning is something fixed, because within the systems described in the secret teachings of all ages, meaning is not treated as a stable property of a word or a symbol. It is treated as something that emerges, something that takes shape through interaction, through context, through the relationship between different elements within a structure. This is why symbols are rarely presented in isolation. They are arranged, placed alongside other symbols in patterns that create a field of meaning rather than a single point of definition. For example, a circle on its own may suggest unity or completeness, but when placed within a square, it begins to suggest containment. When divided, it can suggest cycles or phases. When combined with other forms, its meaning shifts again. The symbol does not change. The relationship does. And it is within that relationship that meaning begins to form. This is what gives symbolic language its flexibility. It is not bound to a single interpretation. It is capable of holding multiple layers at once, each one becoming visible depending on how the structure is engaged with. But this flexibility also requires discipline, because without structure, symbolic meaning can become vague, undefined, open to interpretation in a way that loses coherence. This is why the mystery traditions do not treat symbols as free, floating images. They place them within systems, within arrangements that guide how they are encountered, how they are combined, how they are revisited over time. And through this repetition, through this controlled exposure, something begins to stabilize. Not a fixed meaning, but a pattern, a recognition of how certain symbols interact, how certain relationships produce consistent effects. This is what allows symbolic language to function as a form of communication, not because it delivers the same meaning to everyone, but because it operates within a structure that produces recognizable patterns. The initiate begins to see these patterns, not immediately, but gradually. At first, the symbols may appear abstract, disconnected, difficult to interpret, but as exposure continues, as the same forms are encountered in different contexts, something begins to shift. Connections start to form, relationships become clearer, and what once seemed separate begins to align. This is not memorization, it is recognition, a process that develops over time as the individual becomes more familiar with the structure. And once this recognition takes hold, symbolic language begins to feel different, less like something to be decoded, more like something to be engaged with, something that reveals itself through interaction rather than explanation. This is the foundation of the lost language, not a fixed system of definitions, but a dynamic structure of relationships, one that requires participation, attention, and the willingness to allow meaning to develop rather than forcing it into immediate clarity. Because within this system, clarity is not the starting point. It is the result of sustained engagement. And that engagement is what allows symbolic language to carry meaning across layers that words alone cannot reach. If symbols create meaning through relationship, then the next layer of this language lies in how those relationships are organized over time. Because symbolic language is not only spatial, it is sequential. The order in which symbols are encountered changes how they are understood. The same form, presented at a different stage, carries a different weight, not because its meaning has been altered, but because the context surrounding it has shifted. This is where symbolic language begins to resemble a process rather than a static system. Across the traditions explored in the secret teachings of all ages, symbols are introduced in sequences that mirror the progression of the initiate. Early symbols establish a foundation. They appear simple, accessible, almost familiar. They provide an entry point into the system without overwhelming the individual. But as the sequence continues, those same symbols return, not as repetition in the conventional sense, but as reintroduction. Each time they appear, they are placed within a different context, combined with new elements, positioned within a broader structure that changes how they are perceived. This creates a layering effect. Meaning is not delivered all at once. It accumulates, not through addition but through reconfiguration. The initiate begins to recognize that what they understood previously was not incorrect, but incomplete, that each interpretation was only one aspect of a larger pattern that could only be seen once more of the structure had been revealed. This is why symbolic language resists final definition, because any fixed meaning would interrupt this process. It would stop the sequence. It would reduce the symbol to a single point, rather than allowing it to function as part of a dynamic system. And this is also why symbols are often embedded within stories, rituals, and environments, not because they require narrative to exist, but because narrative provides sequence, a way of moving from one symbol to another in a controlled order, a way of guiding attention so that relationships can emerge gradually rather than being presented all at once. This is where the initiate begins to see that symbolic language is not separate from the structures explored earlier. It is integrated. The temple provides spatial structure. The initiation rites provide experiential structure. The secret schools provide organizational structure, and symbolic language moves through all of them, linking each element together, ensuring that meaning is not isolated within a single form, but distributed across a network of relationships that can be revisited and reinterpreted over time. This integration is what allows the system to remain coherent, even as it adapts, even as it appears in different cultures under different names, expressed through different symbols, because the surface may change, but the underlying structure remains, and that structure is what carries the language forward, not as a fixed vocabulary, but as a method, a way of organizing meaning so that it can continue to develop without losing its coherence. And once this is recognized, the idea of a lost language begins to shift. It is no longer something that has disappeared. It is something that has been overlooked, still present, still operating, but no longer recognized as language in the way it once was, which is why it requires a different kind of attention to engage with it again. not translation, but participation. When you look at symbolic language through a modern lens, it is easy to reduce it to something decorative or abstract, aesthetic, interesting but not essential, because modern communication is built around clarity, around efficiency, around the idea that meaning should be delivered as directly as possible, with as little ambiguity as possible. And within that framework, symbols appear inefficient. They do not define, they do not conclude, they do not provide immediate answers. But this is precisely what gives them their function. Because what symbolic language demonstrates is that not all forms of understanding benefit from being reduced to clarity too quickly. Some forms of understanding require space. They require time. They require the ability to hold multiple possibilities at once without collapsing them into a single conclusion. This is what symbols allow. They create a field where meaning can exist in layers, where relationships can be explored without being fixed, where recognition can develop gradually rather than being imposed immediately. And once you begin to engage with symbols in this way, something starts to become visible that is not as apparent within linear language. The process of meaning itself, not just what something means, but how that meaning forms, how it shifts depending on context, how it expands as new relationships are introduced. And this is where symbolic language begins to feel less like a tool and more like a mirror. Because the way you interpret a symbol reflects the way you process information more broadly. The patterns you recognize and the connections you prioritize, the assumptions you bring into the interaction, all of these influence what the symbol reveals, which means the symbol is not only communicating something about the system it belongs to, it is also revealing something about the individual engaging with it. This is why symbolic language was so central to the mystery traditions, because it allowed for a form of communication that operated on multiple levels at once. It could convey structure, while also revealing the state of the individual encountering that structure. It could guide perception, while also reflecting how that perception was developing. And this dual function is difficult to replicate through words alone, because words tend to move in a single direction, from definition to conclusion. Symbols move differently. They loop, they expand, they return. They reveal different aspects depending on how they are engaged with over time. And this is why they remain relevant, even in systems that appear to rely entirely on language. Because beneath the words, the patterns are still there. The relationships are still forming. The structures are still shaping how meaning is created. The difference is that they are no longer recognized as part of a language. They are seen as background, as secondary, as something that supports communication rather than something that is communicating in its own right. But once you begin to recognize them again, that perception changes. The background becomes active, the structure becomes visible, and meaning begins to feel less like something that is given, and more like something that is discovered through interaction. If symbolic language reveals that meaning can exist before words, then its impact extends far beyond the systems that originally preserved it. Because once you recognize that symbols operate through relationship rather than definition, it begins to change how all forms of communication are understood. Words no longer appear as complete. They appear as approximations, useful, precise in certain contexts, but limited in their ability to hold multiple layers at once. And this does not make them ineffective. It places them within a larger framework, one where language is not the starting point of meaning, but one expression of it. Because beneath the words, the patterns remain. The relationships continue to form. The structures that guide interpretation operate whether they are recognized or not. And this is where the idea of the lost language begins to take on a different meaning. It is not lost in the sense of being gone. It is lost in the sense of being overlooked, present but unacknowledged, functioning but no longer recognized as a system, which means it can be encountered again, not by reconstructing it exactly as it once was, but by shifting the way attention is directed, by moving away from the need for immediate clarity, by allowing meaning to develop through interaction rather than forcing it into fixed definitions. This is what the initiate learns to do, not to replace language but to see beyond it, to recognize when words are sufficient, and when they are only pointing towards something that requires a different kind of engagement. And once this distinction becomes clear, communication itself begins to change. It becomes less about delivering conclusions and more about creating conditions where understanding can emerge, where connections can be made, where meaning can develop over time rather than being fixed in a single moment. This is the continuation of the system, not confined to symbols alone, but extending into how all information is approached, how it is structured, how it is experienced. And as this series moves forward, that structure will begin to appear in new forms, not just in space, not just in symbols, but in systems that organize thought itself. Because if meaning can be shaped through symbol, then it can also be shaped through number. And what happens when number is used not just to measure reality, but to structure it?